Hi, everybody. I think we'll get started. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. My name is Joseph Zamaria, and I'm on the faculty here in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the University of California, San Francisco School of Medicine. And as well, I'm the chair of the selection committee for this lectureship. On behalf of the selection committee, it's my sincere pleasure to welcome you all to the 2025 Robert S. Wallerstein, MD, visiting lectureship in psychoanalysis and psychotherapy. Before we get started with today's program, I'd like to express thanks to some persons and some groups who have made this event possible. Thanks, as always, to the UCSF Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences for hosting this event since its inception in 2006. Thanks to the leadership of the UCSF Psychiatry Residency Training Program, who have continued to prioritize our psychiatry residents' attendance at this talk. And I'd like to express my sincere gratitude to the Wallerstein family and to all those who have contributed to the lectureship fund, whose care and generosity are essential to the existence of this lecture. I'd like to express some thanks to my colleagues on the Robert S. Wallerstein Lectureship Selection Committee, who I've known for a relatively short while in my 5 years or so on the committee. Many have been part of this committee tasked with putting together this event since its beginning. And most have had a personal relationship with Bob Wallerstein. I've learned invaluably from you all, and in particular, I'd like to thank Mary Susan Hansen and Amy Wallerstein-Friedman, who were particularly generous with their time and guidance this year as I navigated myriad life stressors and some extenuating circumstances. So thank you, Mary Susan and Amy. And lastly, a huge thanks to Michelle Sim, our administrative staff support person. This is Michelle's first year in this role after the departure of a staff person, Gina Martinez, who had served in the role for many years. Michelle was a quick study. She stepped up in an incredible way to make sure that this event would go off without a hitch. We wouldn't be able to pull it off if not for her hard work and her logistical skill. Yep, you're here. Her professionalism and attention to detail really shone through as we were getting prepared for today. And I look forward to getting to know Michelle better in years to come. So really special thanks to Michelle. So before we dive into today's program, I'd like to say a few words about the namesake of this lectureship, Dr. Robert Wallerstein. Bob Wallerstein was a psychiatrist, psychoanalyst, and chair of this department from 1975 to 1985. I didn't have the pleasure of knowing Bob, but his legacy speaks for itself. Those who knew him often talk about his identity as both a researcher and a clinician, about his generosity as an educator, and his inclusiveness towards all mental health professions. Dr. Wallerstein trained at the Menninger Foundation in Topeka, Kansas, where he rose to become the foundation's director of research and conducted a pioneering study called the Psychotherapy Research Project. He moved to the Bay Area in 1966 as chief of psychiatry at Mount Zion and joined the faculty at UCSF as a professor of psychiatry. Bob was a powerfully influential scholar and a prolific writer. He wrote 20 books and over 400 scholarly papers. And he championed some principles that I think are really important, perhaps especially today. First, the integration between the worlds of empirical research and clinical wisdom, and also pluralism within psychoanalysis and psychotherapy. So both these principles, there's the idea of taking multiple vantage points to see things more clearly. So whatever's your interpretation of the times in which we're living, which are rife with social unrest, political instability, and certainly widespread psychological distress, it's important to be able to see clearly. Even if one even if what one is trying to see is simply one's own experience. And I think Bob would have continued to champion depth-oriented psychotherapy as a force which can help people make sense of their experience, process trauma, and cultivate resilience. And so I offer a couple of quotes which I believe capture that spirit. First, from Michael Eigen. As long as feelings are second-class citizens, people will be second-class citizens. Experience is an endangered species. An important function of psychotherapy is to make time for experiencing. Psychic taste buds really exist and rarely rest. They feed us each other. Gauge states of being, states of spirit. We taste each other's feelings and intentions. And one more from Kirkland Vaughn's New York-based African-American psychoanalyst. In times of societal upheaval, the unconscious mind bears the brunt of collective anxieties. Psychoanalysis offers a pathway to navigate these turbulent waters by delving into the depths of individual and communal experiences. So with that, it's my distinct pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Francisco González. Francisco J. González is a psychiatrist and community psychoanalyst who helped found and serves as co-director of the Community Psychoanalysis Track at the Psychoanalytic Institute of Northern California, PINC, where he is also a personal and supervising analyst. He's on the faculty of PINC, as well as the NYU postdoctoral program in psychoanalysis. His writing, over 45 papers and book chapters, has been the recipient of the Simmons Award, the Ralph E. Rotten Paper Award, and co-recipient of the JAPA Award for the best published paper in 2019. In 2023, he was designated a distinguished psychoanalytic educator by the International Forum for Psychoanalytic Education. He serves on the editorial boards of Psychoanalytic Dialogues, JAPA, and Parapraxis, and was on the Holmes Commission on Racial Equality in the American Psychoanalytic Association. He practices privately in San Francisco and Oakland, and in the public domain at Instituto Familiar de Raza in San Francisco. So let's please give a warm welcome to Dr. Francisco González.
Good afternoon. Give me just a second to put on things that allow me to actually see what I'm doing. Okay. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be here today. I want to thank you, Joe, and Amy Wallerstein and the committee for inviting me. And I know a lot of work goes into producing an event like this. And a particular thanks to Tosin Adeviyi for being in conversation with me today. I'm really looking forward to that and have enjoyed getting to know you just a little bit. So my subject today, the double provenance of the unconscious, in many ways came to me rather than me to it. The subject itself emerges from my experience as an individual in groups and is a story, a theoretical one in this case, that I hope to tell, of the groups that live through me. Hi, I'm good. Thank you. All right. Oh, it's always good to have mentorship, and Mark Jacobs has been doing that for me for a long time. And so I want to start with one way of telling the story of how I came to be before you today. I came to San Francisco General Hospital, that's what it was called then, as a medical school student in the late 80s. and worked on Unit 7A with Joellen Brainin Rodriguez, who was an amazing and inspiring psychiatrist, Puerto Rican, who danced samba at every carnival in San Francisco. And I thought, this is the kind of person that I would want to be. It was a place where I was able to work and learn in Spanish and bilingually with patients and staff, and that was quite a unique experience for me. And so I came then here to residency and graduated in 1995. Now, 1995 seemed to me like just yesterday, but when I saw this clip for a Motorola phone for like $20, and specifically with an instructional videotape included for its learning how to use it, I recognize that it's really of a different era. But of course, it was this article, Psychiatry Finds Room on the Couch for Patients' Cultural Background, that really caught my eye. At San Francisco General Hospital, we offer residents training on units that are focused on different cultural groups, said Francis Liu, co-director of the Cultural Competence and Diversity Program. And it was indeed there where I cut my teeth as a psychiatrist. It was a very rich, if also complicated place to work on ethnically focused psychiatric units. But I learned a great deal, and it really marked me. On graduating from residency, I became an attending on 7B, which was then the HIV and LGBT unit, and was there from 95 to 97. That was a time when we still had like an AIDS dementia unit at St. Mary's, and people, even though we now had good antiretroviral treatments, people were still dying. They had just really come out. It was a strong cultural focus with a psychodynamic bent. I was chatting a little bit with Amy Wallerstein just before, and was saying that even in 1991, when I came to UCSF, there was still some of the legacy of Bob Wallerstein. And when I did psychotherapy training, all of my supervisors were analysts. So there was this mix of this cultural environment that really took culture and ethnicity seriously, along with this psychodynamic and psychoanalytic framework that was really deeply influential. In addition to people like Francis Liu and Mary Susan Hansen, who was at the General Den, there was also like Joanne Weil, and there was Anna Spielvogel, who was a Jungian analyst. Gary Grossman, who's now an analyst at SFCP, was working on 7B as well. So it was an environment that melded both of these things. Bob Oken, who was the chair of the department at the time, asked me in my fourth year if I was going to be going into private practice. And I think I said, hell no, I'm going to be a community psychiatrist. And it took a little bit of time to recognize that if you were reading Freud and Lacan on the side for fun, that maybe that meant something. And so eventually I had to give in to my desire, as psychoanalysis helps to teach us. And I went into analytic training. But just before that, when I left the General, I was recruited by Estela Garcia, who was an amazingly grounded administrator and a very passionate psychologist who worked at Instituto Familiar de la Raza. And I started working there in 97 and have been working there ever since. So I think I had the very good fortune of being in community mental health before, during, and after my psychoanalytic training. And having that really tempered something about what can at times be the narrowness of psychoanalytic training, so that I always had this other rail. And today I can't imagine being a psychoanalyst without that community background, just as I cannot imagine being a community mental health worker without my psychoanalytic training. So I started training at Pink in 2004 and graduated in 2009. And I would say that my training was really excellent. Since about 2016 or so, I call that the year of the cataclysm. I think that things really started to change in some pretty intense ways at the level of the social and the political life of the United States. And that definitely bled into institutional life. I think that there isn't a psychoanalytic institute in the country right now that isn't in some ways really roiled by the tensions that are present in our country. And so with the election of Trump in 2016, the murder of George Floyd, the rise of Black Lives Matter, DEI programs, which are now, of course, being completely deconstructed, the local fires, and then COVID, there was quite a different shift in the tenor of my psychoanalytic practice. A few years ago, I came across this little article in the New York Times about, in an age of constant disaster, what does it mean to rebuild? And I think that while I felt that I was closer to the life of disasters at San Francisco General and at Instituto Familiar, that there was a way that it took a while for it to filter in to the psychoanalytic space. But I was left then really searching for how to integrate something about the socio-political, the cultural life and racialized difference with psychoanalytic theory, which I had really come to love. So part of what I want to do today is lay out and maybe introduce you to some theorists that you may not have heard so much about and who are not read so much, especially in the United States, and try to put forward some ideas about how there might be an integration from these different strata of psychic life. The first person I want to introduce you to is Janine Puget, an Argentinian analyst. Argentina will feature prominently today in different ways, because I think that psychoanalysis in South America was always more open to the social than it was in the United States. But Janine Puget, who died in 2020, coined this term about the excess of the social. And just to give you a couple of quotations from her, she wrote, "The necessity of processing belonging to a world in which events take place that populate the life of the subject without depending on the subject having generated them." Or again, the culture that one belongs to clashes with the culture that one inherited. Certainly, I can remember when cell phones came. I can remember standing in my window of my apartment, and my friend, and now also psychiatrist and analyst Julie Levitt, had a cell phone, and she was walking down the street, and we saw each other at a distance, and we're talking with our cell phones, and we're really thrilled about this crazy new invention, and that was just in the 90s. So the culture that I was born into is very different. The one that I inherited is very different from the one that I belong to now. And she's using that in a kind of more general way. And finally, new marks for which we have no previous inscription are incorporated as intrusive, representing the alienness of the world. So the effects that, the cataclysms that happen in the socio-political order, I think also happened, as I mentioned, to psychoanalysis. And there was a real question about what does it mean to rebuild within the frameworks of psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic theory. I was really captured a few years ago by a quotation from Andre Green. Now, Andre Green is, a very prominent theorist in psychoanalysis, and he wrote, "Rigidly maintaining its classical stance, psychoanalysis could, on the one hand, attach itself to an embalmed and stiffened corpse, failing to pursue a critical evaluation of its theories as challenged by present practice. In this case, it would be pledged to the mere safeguarding of its acquisitions without ever calling into question the theories sustaining them. The alternative is a psychoanalysis which, periodically renewing itself, strives to extend its range, to subject its concepts to radical rethinking, to commit itself to self-criticism." This notion of radical rethinking is part of what I'm interested in pursuing, both in theory and in practice. Radical, of course, means to the root. And I think that there is some way that we need to go to the root basis of psychoanalytic theorizing and rethink an element of it in order to make it more relevant for a 21st century world. What I want to do now is to take Freud and his theorizing and a couple of big shifts in his theorizing as a kind of metaphor. So in a way, I'm going to play a little fast and loose with Freud and use him more metaphorically than just literally, because I think that some of the shifts in his theorizing help us think about how we might use psychoanalytic thinking in a broader way. And so maybe I would say that Freud's ontogeny recapitulates the phylogeny of psychoanalysis, and that as you'll see, that will become a theme that I'll return to in a different way. So you might remember, the topographical model of Freud, which is always depicted as an iceberg. I don't think I've ever seen it depicted in any other way, with the conscious, the preconscious, and the unconscious. And what I want to point out in this is that this is a kind of barren landscape. It's a kind of geographical model of the mind that is not really peopled in any kind of way. It's an empty landscape. And maybe we could say that again, in this kind of loose way, that part of what that did kind of clinically is that it was really in a one-person psychology. I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. But, Freud famously was really trying to separate himself, or to make a place for psychoanalysis that was not simply neurological. He was a neurologist to begin with, and the prevailing theory at the time for hysteria was the theory of degeneracy, and he was really interested in trying to move beyond a framework of degeneracy and to think that there was something else that was going on, and that something else was a mind, not just a brain, and there might be roots, ideologies of psychic disturbance that could be related to one's relationships and what happened in one's early life. He put all that, of course, on the couch, and that the way, at least in the early Freudian thinking and in some strains of psychoanalysis, the analyst was there to kind of look at the patient in a quasi-objective scientific way to try to archaeologically, unpack this unconscious history. And that view was, a one-person psychology. The psychology was the psychology that was on the couch. In 1923, Freud shifted somewhat and developed the structural model. And the structural model is, of course, the model that we recognize as, being the id, the ego, and the superego. This is one of Freud's early drawings. Freud actually has a number of pretty amazing drawings, all the way from neurons to these more kind of organic to then like schematic drawings. And it's actually very interesting. I have a little book that just like goes through all of Freud's drawings, and you can kind of see his evolution as a thinker from a very biological, kind of histological depictions of neuronal matter, all the way to this kind of more abstracted kind of schemas of mind. It's kind of fascinating. But with the development of the structural model, in a certain way, what we had were three little people. Freud called them agencies, actually. And so you had these three different agentic sites that now were a part of the mind. And if you happen to see that, those films that have come out in the last few years about Inside Out, where you have this little committee of folks that are inside, and anger is like trying to deal with jealousy, or that it's like you have a little committee inside of people, a little group that has to like work something out between it in order to drive the car, which is one's personality or psyche. And I think that it's here that we begin, and certainly in other developments, Mourning and Melancholia, et cetera, where you start to get this early object relations model. And so that from that object relations model, which developed later, than Freud himself, what you began to have was not just a transference onto the analyst, but also a development of counter-transference, and that something started to emerge there that moved from a one-person psychology to maybe a 1.5-person psychology first, and then to a 2-person psychology. And out of that 2-person psychology, you ended up with like this field theory. And field theory was developed in a number of different ways, a number of different places. It emerged in South America, in the relational school, in Bion, in Stern. There's a number of different foci of field theory, but we could say in general that there was a conception that something was happening between the two people that created a kind of this third place. In psychoanalysis loves to count to 3. I'm interested in trying to get to 4 and beyond, but it loves to count to 3. And this notion of thirdness was that there's something beyond just the two people that is bigger than both of us. It's if you think about couples, you probably have a sense of how there's a way that the couple organizes, that the couple finds its own kind of division of psychic labor and starts to operate as a kind of entity. If you've ever done couples, therapeutic work, when I see some couples, and when I do, I'm not so much talking to either person as I'm talking to who they are as a pair and how they're functioning as a pair. So this movement, towards a kind of from 1-person to 2-person to this field, I think is quite significant for the kinds of ideas that I want to put forward. Freud himself was, not that far from these kinds of ideas. Starting in 1913 and moving all the way to the end, almost the very end of his career in 1939, his major texts in this list are all trying to deal with something about the collective, about groups, and about who are we together. And so I like to say that it feels to me that Freud was on the cusp of a third revision, beyond the structural theory, and that third revision would have been a revision that took the social in a much more rigorously theoretical way. Now, I feel that Freud was kind of vacillating on the edge of that he oftentimes, say, for example, in the group psychology paper, An Analysis of the Ego, maybe even the title gives it away. You start with the group, but you end, the title with ego. And that there's a way that while he's trying to theorize something about collectives, in my estimation, he keeps kind of tipping back into the individual as a way of trying to explain that. So I think that what we have before us is an opportunity in psychoanalysis in this time of, great turbulence, to try to see how we might rebuild our theory. And, this fundamental revision of our theory in these kind of fast and loose Freudian terms would be that move from the topographic to the social. But in order to make that leap into a rigorous theory of the social, I feel that we're missing a piece. There have been a lot of theorists, especially since the 90s, who were taking social theory, social critical theory, of all sorts of different types, and trying to kind of squeeze it into the individualist models that we have as in psychoanalysis. And I think that oftentimes that felt to me like you were trying to take a square peg and stuff it into a round hole. It was just like the level of abstraction was way too high. I think that the missing piece is the group, that we have an enormous literature in an enormous psychoanalytic literature about the group that can really help us make that bridge so that we can integrate social theorizing in a way that feels much more robust and rigorous. So I want to introduce you now to a few more theorists that we typically don't read. The first is Trigant Burrow. Trigant Burrow is an interesting figure. He was one of the early presidents of the American Psychoanalytic Association. He was in correspondence with Freud. He had a Freudian analysis with Jung when Jung was still a Freudian. He wrote like 70 papers and 7 books, very prominent analyst of his time. And he was expelled from the American in around 1932, specifically because of his views on the group. He was a founder of group analysis in the United States, and he may have been the person to first coin the term the social unconscious in 1924. You know, in many ways, the paper that Freud writes on group psychology and analysis of the ego in 21 might apply most readily to the Wednesday Psychological Society, which was the group that met, that became the Vienna Psychoanalytic Institute. Because in that paper, what Freud postulates as the formation of a group is that everyone installs someone in this position of the ego ideal in their mind, and that leader, you know, kind of coheres the group. And that's very much a story of what happened in the early group of psychoanalysis, is that everyone had installed Freud in their mind, and he was the unquestioned leader. Max Graf, who was one of these early members, said that there was an air of religiosity in that room, and that Freud always had the last word. And so that, I think, shadow has been with us in psychoanalysis from early on, that there was a way in which questions of the group, even though they were foundational to psychoanalytic theorizing, were often extruded. You know, Jung with the collective unconscious was definitely out. And so I think that from very early on, we've been sort of policing the boundaries of psychoanalysis in a way that is pretty antithetical to questions of group theorizing. There was, however, a whole different track that developed. S.H. Fuchs in London, who was analytically trained and was a German British analyst and a founder of group analysis, had this to say: there's a totally different area of which the individual is equally unaware and is as much compelled and molded by these colossal forces as by his own id, and defends himself as strongly against their recognition without being aware of it, but in quite different ways and modes. One might speak of a social or interpersonal unconscious. So my point here then, in kind of the crux of what I'm bringing to you today, is that the unconscious has a double provenance, that there is the individual unconscious, which we've got 125 years of really nuanced, fascinating, useful theory from a psychoanalytic perspective. And then that there is this other unconscious, which is a social unconscious, that really is about the transmission of the histories of groups, which is different than what happens to the individual subject. So to give you a couple of metaphors and images to try to hold that in mind, Freud famously said that there was a demand made upon the mind for work in consequence of its connection with the body. We might also say that there is a demand made upon the mind for work in consequence of its connection with the group, so that there's these two different forces at play. Or here's a different kind of picture to hold in mind. If you were to throw 2 pebbles into a pond and you got this interference pattern, there's a way in which from at one pole you've got the body doing what the body does, kind of like I'll say a subhuman floor. The real, I have no idea what my liver is doing right now, but maybe I have to respond to stuff that's happening inside of me and that bubbles up. And from the other side, there's something that's happening at the level of a group that I'm also not particularly aware of, but that I also have to respond to. So that, here now, for example, I can tell you that the ways that I'm feeling, or like what it's like to be in relation to you as a mass, is different than what it was like, to wake up this morning and say hello to my husband. So it's like there's something about the group that exerts its own effects. Now, those are kind of heuristics. They're just ways of trying to grab onto something. But of course, it's not that separate. The social unconscious, if we can use that term, and the personal unconscious are necessarily interrelated. That like a Klein bottle, as an analyst, I have to appreciate, like that I could use that little pun, or a Mobius strip. It's always the case that we are both embedded in groups and that there are groups which are embedded in us. Donald Winnicott famously said that there's no such thing as a baby without a mother. And I would say that there's no such thing as an individual subject without a group either. That we are dependent upon groups for our very survival, and that there's this kind of interrelationship between the inside and the outside. So when I say that there's a double provenance to the unconscious, I might say that we're a little bit like the dual theory of light in physics, that we are both particles and waves, that we are particles in the sense of a conventional I of psychoanalytic theory, and that we are waves in the way that groups speak through us, the we in me and the we of us, that there's when I'm in a part of a group, I'm a particle in that bigger wave of things. And Wilfred Bion, who is probably the psychoanalyst in mainstream analysis that's most referenced about questions of groups, talked about that there were different mentalities in a group. He called them basic assumptions: dependency groups and pairing groups and fight-flight groups. And other people have developed other basic assumptions: massification, me groups, etc. So, but what he was saying is that there's a way that when you're in a group, the group mentality, whatever that might be, can recruit you for certain functions in the group. It can you find yourself saying and doing things as part of that mentality, and so that's what I mean by this sense of a wave. So the social unconscious then has everything to do with a history of groups, and what I want to emphasize is that history of the group is of a different order than the individual. So I'm interested in developing a theory or furthering a theory that's been developed that doesn't reduce the group to individual psychic dynamics. Maybe many of us have had the experience of entering, say, an institution. I'll use my own example. When I became a candidate, at Pink, it was clear to me in becoming a member of that institute that some stuff had happened there, like in the past. Like I didn't know what it was, but I could feel some stuff has come down here, and that I think that that's the case whenever we enter any group. I suppose from a conventional psychoanalytic model, you enter a certain family by virtue of being born into it. And it doesn't take that long before you start to realize some stuff has happened in this family. It's not just my mother, it's like there's a history of things that have happened in this family that I may not even know, or I may not ever come to know, but that I can feel the kind of effects of that in the family. So I'm really interested in that kind of different levels. It's a dynamic process, however, not a static one. So Enrique Pichon Rivera, like I said, Argentina is gonna. I'm Cuban, by the way. I'm not Argentinian, but the Argentinians have done some really great theorizing about the social. Enrique Pichon Rivera was born in 1907, died in 1977. He was a founder of the Argentinian Psychoanalytic Association, and he later left institutional psychoanalysis and became a social psychoanalyst. He developed a school of social psychology, he called it. So he was a prominent voice in thinking about the social in Latin America. And he wrote, "All unconscious life, that is to say, the domain of unconscious fantasy, should be considered as an interaction between internal objects," which he thought of as the internal group more than say like, maternal or paternal internal object, in a permanent dialectical interrelationship with the objects, the groups of the external world. Or again, through a permanent praxis, in so much as he modifies himself, he modifies the world in a permanent spiral movement. So what I think Bishan Rivera is saying here is that there's a way in which I enter a group, that group becomes a part of me, it changes my internal group, I enter another group because of the ways that I'm changed, something changes in that group, and there's this kind of process of this permanent spiral movement, a kind of breathing in and out at the level of groups. Another voice, this time French and still living, is René Cailles, who talks about being a subject of the group. And here's what he has to say. To be a member of a group is to be subject to, that is, subjected to, its norms, rules, dreams, taboos, and prohibitions. In a certain way, he's drawing this straight out of Freud and like Civilization and its Discontents, who says that we have to we have to like tamp ourselves down in a certain way in order to be in a group. Cailles is just extending that, saying that there's all sorts of unconscious pacts, he calls them, that hold a group together and that we're subject to by being a member of that group. He says we form unconscious alliances and pacts with each other in constituting a group. So in developing that idea, he had this notion of the intersubject. And what he says is that the subject is divided between the demands imposed on him by the necessity of serving his own purposes, and those that derive from his status and function as a member of an intersubjective chain, of which he is at one and the same time the servant, the link of transmission, the heir, and the actor. So again, coming back to, for example, my training experience, I certainly serve pink, now, but also something got transmitted into me through that training experience, just as something got transmitted into me through my training here at UCSF. Where I started saying about like the inpatient units, and this morning I was realizing that I had a year of group work as a trainee at UCSF, where I conducted groups and was supervised, and where I was also in a process group for 4 years that met weekly. And I think that those experiences were actually quite formative in changing my internal group, so that I became more and more interested in trying to figure out something about this link between groups and the social and individual psychology. So that's a way in which I inherited something, and I just found out from Tosin a little while ago that Elaine Cooper is still around, that I inherited something through that training, that was not exactly conscious, but that shaped me, and that inheritance comes from a different vector than just my family, which also had a lot to do with, I was born into an immigrant family that was 3 generations extended, so that also had a lot to do with my interest in groups, but there was this other vector that met it. Okay, so the last person that I want to introduce you to in this section is Frantz Fanon, who was a Martinican psychiatrist and psychoanalytic thinker. He wasn't formally trained as a psychoanalyst, whose maybe most famous books are Black Skin, White Masks and The Wretched of the Earth. And he became a revolutionary for the Algerian War of Independence. And he said, besides phylogeny and ontogeny stands sociogeny. And, Freud's notion of a group depended a great deal on phylogeny. He comes up with this kind of wild biological myth of the Ur-father and the primal horde and the band of brothers who end up killing, the Ur-father, and then they use a totem to kind of carry that ritual forward so that you don't have to keep killing someone, etc. And the way that Freud has to explain it is almost like there's a kind of psychic DNA that we've inherited this story, and that there's this phylogenetic, kind of perpetuation. And that is not an easy pill to swallow, though I love the story, but as a story, Fanon says there's something else, and that's sociogeny, which is the inheritance that comes through being born into a social order, and that what you get in that social order, which is different than something that you say your identification with the superego in your father or something like that. It's of a different order. He says what emerges then is the need for combined action on the individual and the group. So to recap a little bit, the social unconscious is a different register of the unconscious, not reducible to the individual. It has to do with group norms, alliances, pacts, taboos that are enacted unconsciously. It's the domain of cultural difference. It is related to group object relations, which I might say a little bit more about in a minute, rather than individual object relations. And it is instantiated whenever I say we. Now, it's a lot more complicated than that, actually, because thinking at this intersection becomes quite complex, because we're never actually the member of just one group. And any group is always has this diversity of people in it. I'm pulled in different directions. Like, say, for example, right now, there's a part of me, I can speak about it concretely. I couldn't give this lecture in Spanish, for example. So the part of me that thinks and is in Spanish can't be here with you. There's always there are parts of me that belong to other groups that can't be in any given group. And by the same token, if we all sat around and started to process together, we would pretty quickly discover that there's a lot of difference in this room, and that there would be tensions in this room that would pull this us as a group apart in different ways too. So there are centrifugal forces at the level of the ego and at the level of the group that are pulling outwards, and something has to cohere that, sometimes violently, to bring the group together, as one thing, which it never quite is. What does all of this mean for our work then? I'm going to suggest, again, in a kind of simplified way, that there is a way that we can think about the implications for outside of the consulting room, the dyadic consulting room, into the community, and that we can look inside into the consulting room. And I'm going to start actually with the outside. What I want to think about this notion of what I call the demarcation of the social field, and say, that what we have traditionally done in psychoanalytic thinking is that we've singled out a dyad as the location of work, and that there are ways, I think, to work with the social and the group order in a dyad. But we're familiar, as I already mentioned, working with a couple, that there's something a little bit bigger. And of course, we know about working with families, and I think that can extend to communities. So part of the way that I think about things is that psychoanalytic process can happen at a lot of different scalable dimensions that are not necessarily just individual work, and that we can work psychoanalytically with larger groups, though it looks differently. In that way, we have to move from a kind of more reified or concretized notion of the frame, the 50-minute hour, the office, etc., to questions of framing. Like, how is it that we hold a space in a particular kind of way that allows psychoanalytic process to emerge? That presents us, well, first I wanted to say this, that in my view, then all analysis is applied analysis, whether that's applied to the dyadic setup or any other kind of setup. French analyst Didier Uzel says that there are concretizations of psychoanalysis, that psychoanalysis is polymorphous, and that it gets concretized in different ways. The couch and chair being one such method, one such concretization, but that there are others. I think that this process of demarcation leads to an ethical dilemma. And I want to review very quickly the argument that I make in this article, First World Problems in Gated Communities of the Mind, that was published in the Quarterly in 2020. I became interested in this with patients who, loved to say, talk about first world problems. And here's a good example of a first world problem. I hate it when my house is so big that I have to use 2 routers. But what I was interested in is that there's a way that in referring to a first world problem, there's a kind of implicit sense of noting that there are other worlds than the first world, right? And so during when we had the fires and then the subsequent year we had COVID, it was so clear how interconnected the worlds were. But I had a patient who said, the air quality here is as bad as it is in Mumbai, but we didn't move to Mumbai. We chose to live here, and was really, I think, kind of affronted by this notion that our air quality had sunk, to the level of, quote, the third world. What became clear is that Wuhan and Milan are interconnected, right? And so this notion of the first world problem, I thought, was quite interesting. And I thought that it was a way of saying, let's not think about them by not thinking about me. That I could dismiss something inside of me, making reference implicitly to other worlds than my first world, but I could just wipe the whole thing off of the table and not have to take up the question either of myself or of the social order in any real way. That led me to think about this ethical problem about demarcating the field, and that is that analytic work definitely requires closed doors. Analysis means to undo, to lies. And to do that, you have to have something that holds you together. You can't just be completely wide open, or you would just kind of bleed out, right? So, but while analytic work requires closed doors, we have to constantly be thinking about on whom or on what are we closing the door. What do we keep out of psychoanalytic thinking or psychoanalytic process? And whom do we keep out of psychoanalytic processes, including training? Before I became a psychiatrist, I got a master's in literature, and I wrote on Jorge Luis Borges. And Jorge Luis Borges has this metaphor where he talks about the sphere of knowledge. And he says that as the sphere of knowledge grows, so does its contact with the unknown. The more you know, of course, the more that you don't know. And I think that that's maybe applicable to this ethical question, that the more that we open the door, the greater our contact with pain and the excess of the world, the excess of the social that Janine Pouget was writing about, ultimately to an unbearable degree. So we have to demarcate the field for our work, but we also need to be thinking about who we're leaving out as we make those demarcations. And so I think that psychoanalysis might help us to become more conscious of how and on whom we close the door at any given time. That the problem is with that little tiny word "we," which, as I've said, is a marker, I think, of the social unconscious, because the "we" is always, when I say we close the door, who am I referring to there? Who is the we that would close that door? That's kind of a blitz of ways that we might be thinking about the outside, about community, or maybe more about the place where outside and inside come together, that integrated place. What I want to tell you about the ways that this might make a difference in psychoanalytic thought and work is the development of a way of thinking about community psychoanalysis. So in 2016, a group of psychoanalysts and community mental health workers came together to try to think about the intersection of psychoanalysis and community mental health. We were interested in that because we felt that psychoanalysis had become something of a gated community of the mind and was kind of exclusive, had demarcated itself in a way that kind of kept a lot of things out, but also because we felt that community mental health had become manualized and in a way that was no longer focusing, for I think economic reasons more than anything else, on deep relationship. So we were interested about the intersection of those two forms of practice. And what came out of that was the Community Psychoanalysis Track and Consortium at Pink. That the consortium is a group of psychoanalytically thinking practitioners in community mental health that represent loosely a network of organizations. And then we have the actual training track at Pink. And there is a collaborative kind of discussion between people in the consortium and people in the track for developing a project. That project has typically been a group in a community mental health agency. There is then what we call a core seminar that provides a reflecting space for that project. So what does that look like? The community project has three components. The first is that there's a project group, I'll call it a reflective case conference. Two candidates go into that agency and conduct a group in that agency. Even though there's a kind of focus on the work, what emerges from that is quite a lot of process. The two candidates then also have a debriefing session with each other each week at the agency site. And finally, they meet with what we call a site liaison, who is a senior person who works at that community agency, and they spend an hour in conversation with that person. So they're at a community site for about 3 hours or so every week during a year. They bring process material from all of those different, those three different foci. They bring process material to the core seminar. Now, the core seminar is composed of the candidates plus what we call community psychoanalysis supervising analysts. These are graduate analysts who have been further credentialed as community psychoanalysis supervising analysts. They need to demonstrate, work in the community. We have a supervision seminar for them. We've got a mentorship. So we want to make sure that these are analysts who understand something about community work, not just private practice dyadic work. And then we also have what we call community consultants. And these are psychoanalytically oriented thinkers who are not formally trained as psychoanalysts, who are part of this group. And we think that that's important because, as I was saying a little bit earlier about Renee Kais, that we inherit things unconsciously from our formation, from our membership in groups. So when you're trained in any particular way, there's all sorts of things that you're taking in that you're not conscious of. We thought it was important to have people who were not formally trained as analysts in dialogue with people who are formally trained as analysts, along with the candidates, to help kind of open that space up and try to get more conscious about what's in our formation. The group itself then, this core seminar, has its own group process that develops over time. And it's really the entire core seminar as a group that provides the supervision for the work that the candidates are doing. It's not it's not one person supervising, it's a group that's supervising. And in that way, we think of it as groups listening to groups, and there's material that flows back and forth between those groups. So there's ways too that the stuff from the project group becomes illuminating about things about what it means to be an analyst, for example, in ways that we're positioned. So it's a collective form of listening. If you're interested, you can go to our website at pinkcptc.org, and there's a lot more of information there about the work that we're doing in community psychoanalysis. Okay, I'll wrap up with just looking towards the inside of the consulting room, because so many of us do dyadic work as opposed to community work, and how might this way of thinking be helpful? There was a paper that I published in 2020 that I called Trump Cards and Klein Bottles on the collective of the individual. And I'll tell you a little bit there about the case of Evan. That paper is mostly a case study. A woman that I'd been seeing in analysis, I still see her. I'm probably seeing her for like some 20 years. The bulk of that time at the beginning was 4 and 5 times a week, and then we tapered down. I see her twice a week, and was seeing her at twice a week frequency in 2016. Trump had just been elected, and Evan had a real breakdown, I would say. It wasn't just that she was upset about the election, but I feel that the floor under her kind of got pulled out, and she really was having a very, very difficult time. There were ways that we worked with that in more conventional kind of individual object relations kinds of ways about her family history, about she had an intrusive, overbearing mother, and there were ways that Trump kind of echoed, things about that mother, but none of that seemed to be getting very much traction. And so the paper is really trying to bring this way of thinking about groups to this dyadic space. And the thing about Evan is that she had, in addition to being in her family of origin, she had a kind of adopted immigrant Chinese family that she became very dear to, and they were very dear to her. And it was kind of a second family. And she had a different way of being in that family than she had in her home family. And then after that, there were a number of different groups that she was a member of, athletic groups and political groups and artistic groups. And there was a way I felt that what Evan was having a hard time doing was putting the different parts of herself together. I mentioned earlier about group object relations. Rather than just a one-to-one object relationship, I think there are also one-to-many object relationships. Like I'm in a one-to-many object relationship with you right now. Whenever we're in a group, we're in that one-to-many object relationship. And so we might say, or I might say, that the different kinds of ways that Evan was located in those different groups over time, those groups, those parts of her couldn't come together to make a good working group inside of her. That she couldn't bring the person she was from her home family, the immigrant family, the athletic groups, which she was deeply involved in, the artistic groups, the political groups, which she was deeply involved in. It's like the way that she was constellated as a person in relation to those others, she couldn't form an internal group out of those people inside of her, and so it felt very fragmented. And part of the reason she couldn't do that is because the groups that she belonged to and the groups that I belonged to were keeping us quite separated. She and I couldn't make a good group together. We got into a bunch of stuff about my being a Latino man and her being a white woman. And there was a bunch of stuff about that, which you can read more about in the paper, that was really preventing us from being able to join as a group and help her consolidate these one-to-many object relationships inside of her. What ended up happening is that by chance, we both ended up at the march. And even though we didn't see each other there, that experience kind of made us part of a similar group, a same group, and that she was able to kind of put these parts of herself together again. So I think that the kinds of things that can be useful in thinking about a dyad in terms of technique is that the collective of the individual manifests, as I've said several times, whenever I say we, that when there's shared, I hesitate to call it trauma because I mean any big social cataclysmic event, whenever there's shared social events like this, it highlights our social positioning in a very specific kind of way. During COVID, for example, I really saw this in my practice. I had people who left the Bay Area. I had people who had the money to leave the Bay Area, but decided that that was not something that they would do. They felt it was wrong to do that. I had people who could not leave the Bay Area. So it really highlighted something about that difference. Or the whole, what's happening in the Middle East with Gaza and Israel. I think that that's been a place where a number of people, colleagues, patients, who felt that we were all more or less on the same page sociopolitically, began to discover that actually we may be on the same page, but we're not in the same paragraph, or we're certainly not in the same sentence, and that the specificity, the nuance of one's location, like I began to discover things about myself. Oh, I see. I'm just over here compared to where you are, or I'm just a little bit over there compared to where you are. Things that were not conscious to me, but that become more apparent when you have this kind of social, trauma. Because when you're working with a patient and you don't have that, what's happened in their childhood didn't happen in your childhood. But when something is happening at the social level, you're both located in the same thing, but not in the same way. So that's a way to also open up this notion of the social. It's possible then to investigate these one-to-many object relationships and the history of belongings in groups with a patient. And finally, that you can investigate the ways that the internal group for the patient is put together. Okay, so coming back, to this this slide, that if for Freud, the privileged site for the development of psychoanalysis was the hysterical body, I want to propose that for us, again, whatever that us might mean, the privileged site for its further development is the group and its unconscious domain. It's critical, I think, that we come to better understand the unconscious forces that operate there. So if with the concept of the double provenance of the unconscious, I'm proposing a radical revision of psychoanalytic theory, that is one that goes to the root, then it's with the hope that what can come of this is a dispersal, a way to seed the future of psychoanalysis that moves beyond its current limitations and helps us, in its own small way, contend with the realities that threaten to undo us. I thank you for your attention.
All right, we will get started. If you haven't found your seat, please do. What a wonderful talk by Dr. González, and I hope we have some time in front of us with some discussion about these topics. So first, I would like to introduce our case discussant. Our case discussant is Dr. Oluwatosin Adebiyi. She is a voiceover artist, a writer, and a current UCSF psychiatry resident who is passionate about increasing access to mental health care and decreasing mental health stigma through media and digital tools. With a unique background spanning medicine, public health, and studio art, she understands the power of positive impact and belonging. Her mission is to address the complex mental health needs of young people in our rapidly evolving world, striving to develop human-centered, effective systems of care that create belonging through the continuum. This July, Tosin will be UCSF's new Child and Adolescent Psychiatry Public Track Fellow. So let's all welcome Dr. Tosin Adebiyi.
Thank you, Joseph. Thank you to the committee who put this event together. And I also want to acknowledge my peers who are in this space right now, many of whom I've had multiple conversations about the tension between the social, the individual, and us joining this institution as trainees, living in a world where even me being here right now feels like a really deep-seated privilege to feel safe giving you this presentation. So thank you. My name is Tosin, and let's get right into it, shall we? Brief overview of how we will spend our time together. I will be introducing a case, and then we will go into discussion. The hope here is that we all just heard from Francisco about the social unconscious. And this case is honestly a way for us to conceptualize it further. I am a resident here at UCSF, and I'm learning psychodynamic therapy. So this is also an opportunity for me as a new budding psychiatrist to understand my patients and understand myself in our interaction and how that connects to the social. We'll also have some time for questions too. So our case, meet Lily. Lily is a 28-year-old Mexican-American, new mom to an infant, Jay. Lily is an avid watercolor painter. She loves art of any form. Lily normally spends her days taking care of her infant, Jay. She's also talking on the phone with her family. She's painting, she's drawing, and she's also looking for a new job. At 32 weeks of pregnancy, she quit her job at Dick's Sporting Goods. Lily values loyalty, commitment, deep emotional connection, and family. So why did Lily come to see me? Lily's been pretty worried about how she's being perceived. Between visiting her mom, who lives in Riverside, California, and her mom has been pretty sick, between reconnecting with the father of her child, Mr. L, and also this recent decision to quit her job, Lily has been feeling oversensitive, is what she calls it. I'm feeling oversensitive. During her pregnancy, Lily was aching for support. So Lily is here in the Bay Area. Her family is in Riverside, and she just wished her family would show up more. Why didn't they call me? Why aren't they here now? Where are they? What about her partner, Mr. L, the father of her infant? Well, he was physically and emotionally absent. Lily felt lonely. She tried to find her own path and discovered a transitional housing program. She found shelter here when the people in her life that she expected to show up for her in this critical time weren't there. Now, fast forward, she is back in an apartment living with the father of her child, Mr. L, and she's feeling what she calls oversensitive. She describes oversensitive as being easily tearful, flaring up in anger, her emotions washing over her like crashing waves, and sometimes feeling impulsive. During our first session, Lily was quite guarded. At times, she was tearful. She would often wait for me to take the lead. At times, she would also laugh softly to herself, almost apologizing for the stressors she was going through. Our early relationship was separated by time and place. For the first 5 months of our relationship development, we met only 6 times. Recently, we've created a new rhythm where we're seeing each other weekly. So Lily has come to see me because she's feeling oversensitive. A little bit more about Lily, her development, and her early childhood. So Lily's mom and dad met in Mexico City. They emigrated from Mexico to United States in the 90s before Lily was born, and they settled in Riverside, California, where Lily was born. Lily grew up in a Spanish-speaking household, the middle child of 2 sisters. She often felt like the odd one out, she would say. She often felt like she was oversensitive, something she heard her mom and her dad tell her. Lily describes her father as being explosive, she says. He was often inebriated. He was often the perpetuator of physical assaults on Lily's mom. Lily's father wasn't at the home often either. He actually worked in San Francisco, far from Riverside, and would return home every 5 to 6 weeks to be with the family. Even though Lily will tell her dad, "I miss you, please stay," he would leave. Lily often felt worthy, felt loved in her family when she felt she was being valuable. She was often the peacemaker, would try and stop her mom and dad from arguing, would distract her sisters when her dad was yelling. She felt valuable doing that in her family. When Lily was 7, her mom moved her and her sisters to Phoenix, Arizona. Her mom wanted to create some distance between the violence that her children were experiencing. Around the age of 8, Lily's mom moved them back to California, and they settled closer to the Bay Area in San Bruno. When Lily was going to school, she said she felt lonely, didn't have a lot of friends, and still, Lily describes her childhood as being fun. She misses it. She misses growing up with her sisters, misses having fun. It's possible that with the relocation that Lily experienced at a young age due to interpersonal violence, that could have created a sense of instability for Lily. This term, oversensitive, that she heard often, likely means that Lily felt her emotional expression and her emotional experience was invalid. She was looking for containment, looking for an opportunity to connect. And what she heard instead was, "You're oversensitive." Now, a little bit about Lily, her identity, and some of the thoughts, how I'm conceptualizing this case. I believe Lily is at the intersection of worlds. She is a first generation Mexican American, new to motherhood. Her family's still in Riverside, and there's this physical and cultural separation that's happening for her. The familial scaffolding as she's learning how to be a mother, she's looking for it right now. These terms that she's identified with, I'm the odd one out, I'm oversensitive, it likely shows that there's this early belief about the right way to express emotions. I believe Liddy's identity struggles are being compounded by the isolation from her family of origin. The same family that also has rejected mental health concepts. I do believe that this is causing significant vulnerabilities for Lily, her identity, and her self-esteem. So, in challenges that she encounters on the daily, she finds herself being swept up in this emotional wave, this overwhelming feeling of, I am oversensitive. At the same time, Lily loves to paint. Her ability to use painting and her watercolor images shows that there is this strength of her ability to express herself authentically without external judgment. Let's talk a little bit about the patterns of relationship for Lily in this case. I think Lily's relationships echo layers of abandonment. She was labeled as the odd one out, as being oversensitive. Emotions felt too big. She herself felt that she was too much. She found her worth by being useful in family, either the peacemaker between her mom and dad, distracting her sisters. She also calls her dad and describes him as being explosive. It's likely that male figures in her life, at best, seem unreliable, at worst, destructive. Now, with the father of her child, Mr. L, history is repeating itself. When she needed him most during pregnancy, he was physically and emotionally absent, similar to her father. This ache of abandonment, I believe, is present today, and it's part of the reason I believe Lily is coming to see me. Even at work. So Lily quit her job at the 32 weeks of pregnancy. She described just overwhelming sense of anxiety, sometimes even near panic, heartbeat racing, sweaty palms. And that would happen when she was tasked with something new at work, or she had this perception that she wasn't really performing at the level she needed to. She was 32 weeks pregnant and her baby growing was a priority. She quit her job. And still, I do believe that at work, the same pattern of relationship was present. This feeling of inadequacy that she had in childhood. I'm oversensitive. There's something about the way I'm expressing my emotions that isn't quite right. We're seeing that also at work. There's something about what I'm doing right now that's not meeting the level of my performance. A little bit more about Lily, and then we'll dive into discussion. So, defenses. still learning and understanding defenses and how to conceptualize it. I personally, I think defenses are interesting, and I'm excited for the discussion piece when we talk with Francisco on how some of this is showing up in the dynamic with Lily and I, but also in the context of the social world happening around her. So I do believe Lily is internalizing this criticism of not expressing emotions the right way. I think there is splitting that is happening with her partner, Mr. L, sometimes being good, present, and available, or just being bad. And similar within her, that splitting does happen. I also think Lily uses humor as a defense. She's often laughing softly to herself as she shares her stressors, shares parts of her story. I also believe Lily has a really strong capacity for insight. Despite all this, she is showing up and sharing more about her internal world and conceptualizing it and understanding from her perspective why things may be the way they are. Transference. I remember my early email communications with Francisco as he prompted me, so what is the transference between you two? I was going back through my psychodynamic course and asking myself, what is the transference between the two of us? What's the countertransference? Like, what is happening? So thank you, Francisco, for your encouragement and guidance there too. So for transference, when Lily first started meeting with me, she was quite guarded. And typically when she would talk about her family, I think there is a transference from her early experience of emotional vulnerability, of feeling oversensitive. I believe there's this fear that I too will judge her emotions, and invalidate them. Lily has often shared that she wants to do therapy the right way. She's tried it in the past and didn't work. And there's this sense of maybe wanting to also please me that mirrors her childhood, where being helpful was the way her experience felt worthy or she felt worth. Countertransference. I have pretty strong protective feelings towards Lily as she's navigating a number of vulnerabilities, which we will get into later. I think the protective feelings reflect my identification with Lily as she navigates systems of oppression and marginalization and this motherhood that she's experiencing. I also have had frustrations when I deem the progress to be slow. As I mentioned, in the early formation of our relationship, for those first 5 months, we saw each other 6 times across time, across space, sometimes on the phone, sometimes in person. There was this sense of frustration. I'm a psychiatry resident. I need to do psychodynamic therapy, right? I also have this over-identification with the mental health stigma. I identify as a Black woman. I am also Yoruba. And in my culture, when you talk about mental health, there's a whole world of spiritual perceptions of why someone may be struggling at all. I also have to acknowledge my own social position and how that could be influencing how I see Lily's cultural expression and her own views on motherhood. All right, so that is the case. This is Lily. We are going to transition into the discussion. Francisco, if you can join me here on the stage. I've got a couple questions about our case, Lily, so that we can start to apply the concepts of the social and the social unconscious that Francisco taught in this case for Lily. Testing.
I think we're on.
We're on. Okay.
I feel like I'm at City Arts and Lectures.
Oh, so this feels comfortable?
Well, no, I've never been to City Arts. I mean, this is my first foray here. So,
All right then. Well, hello again. My first question for you about Lily. How might we understand identity formation at the intersection of personal and social unconscious domains?
Before we go there, can I just say thank you for a really lovely case presentation? I mean, it's right. It was really beautiful, in a lot of different ways, and I think that that's actually important. Something about, you said that she's a painter, and the sense of aesthetics and beauty, I think, is actually going to be important. So just wanted to say that that's maybe one way that we can think about transference is what gets transmitted through, and you're already transmitting something about your care for her, and something about how it's important, this imagistic register and the question of the beautiful. So just to say that first, really appreciated that. So the question about identity formation, maybe I'll come at it this way through some of the details that you presented, which just to kind of thread through a few things about the sense of oversensitivity, or about the sense of protectiveness or protection, which appears in a lot of different kinds of ways, including in your countertransference, right?
Yeah.
So if there's something about the need to protect a space, maybe a space that is quite sensitive, oversensitivity might, Freud had this thing about about having a contact barrier, and that you have to be able to keep, say, what Janine Puget talks about, the excess of the social. I'm going to talk about things more in this social way rather than in this individual way. To protect yourself against the onslaught of the social, you need to have a contact barrier that has to happen at the level, say, of a group. And if not, then you're really overly sensitive. You're exposed to something that you can't protect yourself from. So I think that there's something about that, and the question of culture, immigration, ethnic identity, that we could take from the individual level to what it means to immigrate into a country, for example, where you don't feel that sense of protection, and when you're assaulted by the social order in a particular kind of way. And how does that get built, and how do we see that emerge in an individual therapy? So in addition to any kinds of identifications that she might have, like say with her mother or something like that, I also wonder about, there's an analyst, Maurice Apres, who talks about this thing that he calls the pluperfect errand.
Oh, please tell us more.
And the pluperfect errand is an intergenerational. He writes a lot about, he's a Black analyst and talks a lot about like culture and ethnic development and systems of oppression. And so the pluperfect errand has to do with how you can be charged with something in a previous generation, and you're now supposed to be the carrier of something, intergeneration, that family, and you've kind of been unconsciously tasked to solve something, a kind of trauma in the family. So if we think about that, I'm really curious about the immigration story of these parents from Mexico City, and what Lily might have been unconsciously tasked with to solve as a social problem, and her sensitivity as something that's kind of crashing through this barrier of protection that has a lot to do with the social order. So that's not to take away from any of the individual ways of thinking about identification in the case, but just to try to, open up this question of the social. So I'll start there.
Thank you for that. Before I go on with my comment, I want to share a different slide.
Great.
I tried my best to also conceptualize Lily from the social. And just for the contrast here, as I went through this case formulation, using more of the psychodynamic framing here, or really the frame, for us to just see how this looks compared to my attempts to bring in more of what Francisco is describing into the social. So we know that at the intersection of the personal unconscious and the social unconscious, that intersection is where we find more of the subjectivity. And that is where I want to know more about Lily.
That's beautiful. I also have to look up Hilda Palafox. That's really cool.
Great artist. Yeah,
Yeah,
I
yeah.
wanted to honor Lily, right, by bringing some of that artwork here that she also resonates with.
That's really beautiful. Yeah, so that's an interesting slide. Maybe we can spend do you want to just walk us through that a little bit?
Yeah. So on the right side, that personal and conscious, that's a little bit of what I did in the beginning with the case presentation, right? I weaved us through her history, the defenses, some of identity, and some of her early experiences. Now, the social and conscious, there were some of that within that case presentation, but I think here we're bringing a real emphasis for how this is also at play in Lily's subjectivity. So in the social unconscious in the family system, Lily is here in the Bay Area, her family is at Riverside, but also when Lily was growing up, there was this unconscious way that Lily related to her family. And as you brought up, there's also this kind of invisible layer that Lily may not be fully aware of, how her family came to be in America. Um, when Lily and I did talk about her family's history, she was not aware of why her parents made the decision to emigrate from Mexico and come here to the United States. She also seemed a little shocked that I asked, like, well, why is that important in this relationship that you and I are forming? Um, in terms of the community connections, I think this is more of what's happening for Lily as she has her relationship with Mr. L, and also thinking about this identity of being a mother now. What does it mean to be a mother in this country, this Western culture that feels different to what she had at home, seeing her mom mother her? The mental health stigma from her family members, while she's also trying to find added support here in the Bay Area. Um, and just bringing more attention to the institutional and economic system. Lily was staying at a transitional housing program when we first met before she moved into the apartment with Mr. L. So this is my attempt to bring more of the social layering and the different aspects of Lily's identity that are taking place in the social and not just in the personal, in the dynamic that she and I have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not surprised that she felt surprised, about your question, and that there may be different dimensions to that. One is just, all this um, focus on protectiveness, how she's also trying to protect you, it sounds like, in some way. That may be one way that we could think of that. I'm thinking a lot about my work at Instituto Familiar, and this notion of confianza, which we use a lot. And confianza just means trust, but it has a particular kind of valorization, I think, in Spanish, and that until you have confianza, until you have that sense of trusting with, a lot of things can't be opened. And it sounds like a lot of what you're doing together right now is building that space, of trust where things can open up. And it's interesting that she doesn't know why her parents immigrated, right? Like that's already a marker of something being a little elided or occluded or something like that, that wouldn't just be a part of her understanding of this story that in a certain way didn't happen all that long ago. It was just like, her parents. So that already kind of says something there. But also that she doesn't seem to be very conscious of whatever that history might be at all. And so that it's probably a little surprising to her even just to have that broached. But when you were saying that part of what she's experiencing now is this geographical distance from her family, that also echoes, something about her parents' geographical difference from their country of origin.
I see.
Yeah, so that there's a way that there's a hidden story in there that is operating at the level of the social, and that there may be things that are unconsciously transmitted to her from that story that maybe has not gotten very worked out, and that she's kind of unconsciously inherited by virtue of her being born into this particular family constellation with this particular social history.
I see. Thank you for bringing in that piece about the geographical distance that Lily is currently experiencing, that her family of origin is too. Lily and I haven't talked about whether she's visited Mexico, if she's visited any family there either. I do want to move on to another question because I do have a number of questions for you, Francisco. So question number 2. You spoke today about demarcation. I'm wondering, how does demarcation help us understand the therapeutic work with Lily facing material instability in particular?
Yeah, maybe in a number of different ways. When I think about demarcation, I'm thinking about what's the space that gets delimited in which a certain kind of psychoanalytic process can happen. So in in a lot of the work that I do that has to do with opening psychoanalytic processes in community settings, so that as opposed to just being a dyadic setting. At Instituto, at the clinic where I work, we often have a fairly elastic border around the frame for doing individual work. So as you know, it's Instituto Familiar de la Raza, and the familiar is familial, and that so that we oftentimes have like collateral sessions or family sessions, and that sometimes the same therapist does individual and family work or brings in someone else. So one way to demarcate the scene might be to think about like whether Mr. L would ever come into the space or not. It's not something that I would recommend at this point because there's just a sense of like developing enough safety, and it sounds like it's important to protect the space that you and she are building together. But I also think about demarcation in terms of being a therapist to the field. I think that in community mental health settings, oftentimes you have to be a therapist not just to the individual, but to a group of providers who often may not quite understand everything that's going on in terms of dynamic processes. And splitting, which you had mentioned, can also happen in this bigger context. So given the fact that she's now in transitional housing,
she is now back with Mr. L. So they're living in an apartment. Right. Yes.
Okay.
But she is still facing kind of financial vulnerabilities and instability and wanting to find a job now and trying to make the decision of, can she balance getting a new job and taking care of her kid? No longer in the transitional housing program, which was a decision she made.
So maybe just as a kind of aside then, just as a heuristic kind of point, that I have oftentimes in Instituto worked with case managers and other people and trying to build, like say a case conference, but trying to think about the field and what gets projected into that field that's coming from the patient's history or family situation. But let me ask you, can you tell us a little bit about Mr. L? Who is this guy?
Yeah, I don't know too much about him. He from what I do know from Lily, during her pregnancy, she tried really hard to keep the relationship stable and there and secure. And Mr. L, reasons that I do not have, did not feel ready to commit and show up for Lily. They were together living in the same apartment when Lily was pregnant, and there was this physical distancing, like Mr. L either not being at home, being away at work, going out for travels, to the point where Lily felt very alone and isolated in that apartment. And she made the decision to leave. She also didn't have her family around. Before she left, she did research and found a transitional housing program, and felt that that space could be safe for her, knowing that there'd be more eyes on her and folks that could essentially be like guardrails for her emotion, because she was still feeling oversensitive during pregnancy. So in short, I don't have a lot of information about Mr. L right now.
Is he American?
Yes, from my understanding, he's also Mexican American.
And do you happen to know anything about his like level of assimilation, acculturation? Is he Spanish speaking, for example, or?
Yeah, let's see. No, I do not know any of those details.
Which is also interesting, right? That, like I say, I think a lot of what's happening right now is just establishing that relationship of, confianza and trust that takes, a lot of time to build.
Yeah.
And so maybe some of those things haven't come in, but it's interesting that we know so little about him.
Yeah.
And maybe that's also kind of a marker, just like not knowing about the immigration story, that's a marker of something. Certainly at one level, we could imagine identifications with her father, for example, and how the father wasn't there or explosive. And maybe there's ways in which she's now, with Mr. L in a way that she might have, have identifications with the father and Mr. L. So that would be at the level of the individual kind of stuff that we know a lot about. But at the level of this social that I'm trying to bring forward, one thing that's interesting is you said that she really enjoyed playing with her sisters. And so there's a little group of girls that maybe provided a certain kind of solidarity, or that there was a way that she might have appeared in that group. You described it as being fun, for example.
Yeah. She has these fond memories of childhood. She'll say that it was fun, and she misses that part of her childhood.
And so that there's something there, not only the relationship with the parents, but also the relationship with the siblings, which is another place that psychoanalysis is. There's been some work. Juliet Mitchell did a bunch of work on siblings, but we tend to think more about these kind of vertical relationships intergenerationally and less about the kind of horizontal relationships with siblings. But there's a place with a sister, she may have found a kind of fun or connection or solidarity that is fortifying to her, and that she seemed to find something like that, say, when she went to transitional housing, she could find these others. And so it makes me wonder about the kinds of transferences that might evolve with you as a sister, and we can take that in the widest possible sense, like somebody who might identify with her about what it means to be not from this place, that kind of solidarity, as well as being a woman, and how what could be developed in a creative way that might emerge from that, and the history of those groups, sisters and maybe other groups that she's been a part of that aren't just this kind of nuclear family kind of thing.
Okay. Thank you for that answer. It's giving me more to consider in this case. And when I do see Lily again, on how thinking about our relation, right? This horizontal, you said, versus vertical relation that Lily had in her family system in particular, how that can be showing up transference in our relationship too. I will move on to our next question. How does the social service system, housing instability, and economic vulnerability create what you term social nausea?
If you're working in community health right now, community mental health, and you're dealing with somebody who needs housing, you're feeling pretty nauseous. It's like the situation in San Francisco specifically related to housing security is abysmal. And so there is this way, I'm thinking of several patients that I have right now, thinking of one patient, again, from the clinic who had a big psychotic break. He's an immigrant living with other immigrants, kind of crowded into this one place. They share rooms, and it was really exacerbating his psychosis. He had a real break, ended up in the hospital, ended up in residential settings, transitional housing, and then we needed to find other housing for him. It couldn't happen. And so now he's back in the original location where he was bullied, and was the material site of his breakdown. And now he's having an exacerbation, even though he was doing really well. So I think when Janine Pouget talks about the excess of the social, we are so barraged, and especially someone who has the kinds of material conditions, who doesn't have the resources to live in one of the most expensive places to live in the world, that it really is an assault, and it's difficult to find that protective layer, that kind of that contact barrier, so to speak, that would provide the protection for the sensitivity that's inside. Certainly, it sounds like Lily suffers from oversensitivity, but whether that's, I imagine her sensitivity is part of what leads to her creativity and her painting.
Yeah.
And that being, there's a way that some people are kind of channeling social inequity in a very direct way. Like it's like they're marked by social inequity in a way that they're carrying the symptom for others. We speak a lot about identified patients in family systems. You know, it's and you're going to be the new child fellow, which is like very cool. That you know how children can come in and be the identified patient for a family, and maybe Lily was something of the identified patient for her family. This is what her sensitivity is, something about carrying something for the
I
family.
see. Yeah, I just want to add that Lily has shared in the past that her family sometimes would keep things from her after some time because they were either afraid of how she was going to respond or react to them.
Which may be a way in which things are kind of deposited, you know, that maybe there wasn't enough emotional processing in the family so that things could be shielded from the kids, but also that they could be integrated into a story, right? So that, for example, even this immigration story, maybe there's a lot that's there for these parents that hasn't really gotten metabolized very much. And then it's just kind of put into her in this indirect way. And that she's carrying this very sensitive, you know, kind of mark, you know, that has to do with that. There was another thread, but which I've lost now, but the repressed always returns. So we just have to keep talking and I'll come back.
We will indeed keep talking. So I'll ask another question then. How could I apply ethics of place to structure my therapeutic approaches with Lily?
When I think about the ethics of place, what I'm thinking about there is positionality. That I think that we, you know, this has to do with the social unconscious, how there's a way that it's easy to be unconscious of your social position.
Yes.
In the social order. And if you're an outsider, gay, Latino, Black, immigrant, you have a lot better view of what's going on in many ways, that the center tends to be invisible. And if you're in the center, you may have no sense at all of positionality. When you're at the margin, maybe more so. But we're all like relatively unconscious about the nuances of our social position. And so I think after more confianza and trust got developed between the two of you, and including work on these individual identifications and her family and so forth, there could be the possibility of moving more and more into questions of social position, hers, yours, the places where there might be homologies, you know, between, like I've written before about homologies of difference, where I can feel a certain kind of resonance, say, with people who are from other countries, who have immigrated, who are bilingual. I can feel a certain kind of resonance about something, even though they may come from very, very different places, speak very, very different languages than I do. But I feel that we share a homology of that difference. And I can imagine that you and Lily might come to places where you could leverage that. And then also the ways in which those are not the same, how you're not positioned in the same way, where the stories, you know, are going to be different for each of your families. But deeper into a treatment, those become powerful levers for opening things up.
Okay. Thank you for that. We're going to move on again to a different question.
Okay.
How can we, and we referring to us here in our social unconscious, we recognize when our clinical training expectations really reflect cultural biases about the therapeutic frame and about therapeutic framing, as you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, I'll answer by association because I'm an analyst, and association is kind of, you know, where the money is for us. that was probably some kind of Freudian slip, actually.
Yeah, can you explain that to folks in the audience who may
I'd
not
have
be?
to lie down, and I think, yeah, not in the moment. But the association that I had to that was, again, Instituto Familiar is coming up so much, I think, in part because of Lily's, ethnic and cultural background, and my own. But I can remember there was a time at Instituto where I was directing a program that was called Calmecac. And basically, we brought all sorts of different providers, activists, therapists, nurse practitioners together, and we did a year of like cultural work. One of the things that we discovered, and that I've also felt sometimes working in an interdisciplinary team that has a therapist and a case manager, is that the therapist is has been so inculcated with a particular way of thinking about what therapy is and what therapeutic progress is, that they can't make as good a connection with the patient as the case manager, or sometimes even the receptionist, or like somebody else who has a different notion of what the connection is. And so I think that there sometimes what we would have to do is help professionalized therapists kind of unlearn a little bit of their training in order to be able to make a better contact. And that it's been interesting to me when in the earlier days of Instituto, the director of the clinic, this woman, this psychologist named Concha Saucedo, who also happened to be a curandera, a healer, in the Yaqui tradition. And there was this one time when we were working with a patient.
Maybe we'll pause for
Yes.
our audience. Could you elaborate on what a curandera is, that type of healer?
A curandera is a healer in a. I'm trying to think of a good translation. I mean, it's a healer in a local. Yaqui is a particular indigenous group in Mexico, and they do like ceremony, and they use herbs, and it's kind of like a folk doctor in a way, but that also does a lot of like spiritual work. And maybe the story I'm about to tell will help kind of elucidate what they do. So I had a patient that I was treating as a psychiatrist. This patient had what I guess by DSM standards would be something like delusional disorder. I was treating her with a low dose antipsychotic. She had a therapist that was working with her largely in a protective way to help, her kind of navigate. It was pretty fixed delusional stuff, but it also had a strong spiritual component. So I want to come back around to that too.
Great.
And ask you a question.
A question for me.
Yeah.
Still great.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay. So the patient that I was seeing was having a really hard time with taking her antipsychotic because it was this Western medicine, and she just felt paranoid in part, but also just suspicious of the whole medical order. And so under the guidance of Concha, this curandera who was the director of the clinic, what we did is that Concha, her therapist, and myself did a home visit to this patient's apartment. And she showed us, like where the spirits were coming and marking, things in the bathroom, and how she had laid out scissors by her bed to cut the spiritual cords, with the other world. And she had an altar, this altar with different deities and her ancestors and so forth. And so what we did is that we conducted a ceremony in which we sacralized the antipsychotic. We put it on her altar. Concha did some invocations. We burned copal. She moved the smoke around. I asperged water in the corners of her apartment. And we recontextualized this Western medication in terms of the cultural language of what she was familiar with.
I just want to pause for the audience. I feel like this example, at least for me, really exemplifies part of the social and in the therapeutic frame. Like you all went to her home to do this. And I'm just curious, after the ceremony at the altar, what happened with the patient and the medication?
Yeah, well, she was then able to take it in a way that before she hadn't been able to. You know, it was like a foreign, like an intrusive kind of foreign body into her system. When it got sacralized and it became something that was usable for her, that kind of got recontextualized. And one of the ways that I think about psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic process is that it's about elaborating the relationship of psyche to materiality. So that's one way that I think about that. And I think that that's a more expansive view, that we've thought a lot about the relationship of psyche to my organismal materiality, my body. But I think that there might also be ways of thinking about psychic process, say, for example, the level of a group or in other social forms that have relationships to different kinds of materiality. And that allows us, I think that there's can be a myth in psychoanalysis in a kind of older school and conventionally practiced that doesn't take up the questions of the material setting so much. And I think that working at the clinic and something about working with this woman helped just exemplify that. And so that I think that there was something that shifted for the medication was a material thing, but it kind of got shifted through this process, which I think of as a kind of analytic process, even though I imagine that Freud would have thought very differently. Though Freud had a lot of, antique, statues and was interested in the fetish and, all of that. So my question for you, if I might, had to do with the question of spirituality. And if there was anything in Lily connected to that, and if that might be an interesting or useful avenue for the work that you have with her.
So right now, Lily doesn't necessarily connect with a specific religion. She talks about growing up in her home, Catholic, and every once in a while going to Mass, but there's not this strong conviction or kind of structured frame of how she sees the world through spirituality or even through her religion. So that hasn't come up a ton for both of us, at least for her in our work together.
Okay, just curious.
All right, we'll move on to, let's see. I think I have 2 more questions, and then we'll take questions from the audience as well. How does the gated communities of the mind apply to this case?
When I think of gated communities of the mind, I'm mostly thinking of institutional structures and how institutional structures can become, just the word institution. I believe we need institutions right now more than ever. But there can also be a way in which institutions can become kind of reified. There's a Greek psychoanalyst and cultural theorist, Cornelius Castoriadis, who talked about that institutions can have what he called a for itself, that there can be a way that once an institution gets going, it just wants to keep going. Anybody who's worked on a committee knows that it's very difficult to disband a committee. The committee just seems to take a life of its own and wants to keep going. And he kind of analogizes that desire in an organization, institution, or committee, kind of like to the ego, and that egos at either institutional levels or individual levels are conservative agencies. They want to. They don't want a whole lot of difference. That's why an analytic process, which is a process of taking apart, of analysis, of licing something, that an ego wants to conserve something, and that to get into a space with an other that allows things to come apart a little bit is not so easy. So I think institutions also tend to have that kind of conservative, consolidating, a gated community of the mind that kind of starts to close off to the social, to others, like who actually is going to be getting training or practicing that kind of thing. I think that's, changing and has changed quite a bit, but in psychoanalysis proper, not enough, I would say. And, we were talking a little bit about your work, and your MPH work and my work on the Holmes Commission, and just recognizing how we're still mightily struggling with racism and other forms of oppression, systemic oppression. And right now we're in an environment in which a lot of that work is being actively dismantled or challenged. So I think of gated communities of the mind in that kind of way. And what would be helpful for Lily, you said something in our email exchange about the kind of maybe the expectations of what therapy is supposed to be like.
Yes.
Yeah. And how are there ways that in our institutional structures we could open up and allow a certain kind of creativity, or different ways of intervening, that might be beneficial to certain kinds of patients who may need a different something, than the some things that we typically provide. And so that's how I think of those gated communities.
Thank you. And also for bringing back our email communication about this case. I had shared with Francisco how, as I first was starting my relationship with Lily, it was separated, right, between time and space. Often we would talk on the phone, not be in person for 20 minutes, sometimes 30 minutes. Sometimes it was for 50 minutes. We saw each other 6 times over the course of 5 months. And there was this pressure through my own assimilation into the social unconscious of my residency training of doing therapy the right way. And what does it mean to still continue to show up with Lily, be aware of that frustration and consider other ways to support her as we're building the relationship as she continues to also show up. So thank you for bringing that back into the context here on the gated communities and how, even for me, that's happening while I'm in residency training, trying to serve another individual who has this really robust dynamic at play when we meet. Francisco, thank you for your time. It's been a pleasure. That was my last question.
Likewise, Justin. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, everyone. We will now transition to questions from the audience. I do believe we'll have a couple microphones going out into the crowd.
See a couple here in the front.
Hi, thank you so much for this talk and this discussion. Your vision of psychoanalysis is one that I would want to be a part of. I have a question about something that I think is kind of suggested, but maybe not said explicitly, and this is the connection between a social psychoanalysis and liberation psychology. So in principle, conscientization, revolution, resistance as a good thing, not as something to overcome, and also militancy. So I don't know as if, Francisco, you could speak a bit to this, and how you envision that connection, if anything.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for your question, and I'm glad to hear that it would be a psychoanalysis that you would be interested in. I think that's part of the work that I'm interested in doing, is to try to open up those doors in ways that does create a certain kind of interest. I think that there are a number of lost legacies of these different lineages and traditions that have kind of fallen away, or that were marginalized, or that were explicitly erased. Like I gave the example of Trigant Burrow, who I think really did initially have a lot to say about the social and the group, and about institutional neurosis and all sorts of stuff. And he was just kicked out. So I think that there's both this active kind of erasure, and then there's lineages that are kind of proximal to, like liberation theology, for example, the work of Freire and others, and then lineages that are kind of on the margin. So right now, Frantz Fanon, is definitely being brought back in to psychoanalytic studies, and as happens, I think, with a lot of psychoanalytic theory, it kind of has to go through the academy and come back around to us. So, for example, Eng and Han took up questions of melancholia and did extensive work on racial melancholia, which I actually would also be applicable in this case to the promise, the American promise of success, the dream, the American dream. And I could speak about this quite personally from a number of cousins who I have who came from Cuba relatively recently and were really expecting everything's good in America, and then they discover that they can't get health care and they can't, get a job, and they, and so that there's this kind of melancholic position that can result from that. But so Fanon is really coming back, and with that, a whole question about resistance and militancy and ways in which the externalization of, say, anger about a system that's oppressive becomes the therapeutic move rather than the internalization. And that if you have a patient internalize some of that anger, then that becomes iatrogenic rather than helping the patient connect up and externalize that anger. And then there's a whole nother lineage that comes through a Catalan psychiatrist, François Tosquelles, who was a psychiatrist who initially was practicing under Franco's Spain, then immigrated to France, and had was maybe the founder of a kind of milieu therapy and what was known as institutional psychotherapy. And a lot of people went through a clinic that he established there at Saint-Alban, including people like Fanon, Félix Guattari, Foucault. There was just it was a site of great intellectual fervor in doing this institutional psychotherapy, which definitely drew on psychoanalysis. And part of that institutional psychotherapy was really interested in things like social positioning, systems of oppression, and how would that get analyzed, as opposed to there being a kind of backdrop where the analyst, is the one in the know. Say again, this is caricatured, but the one in the know and the one in power, and could then help the patient interiorize a certain kind of oppressive system rather than like fight against that oppression. And that school of psychotherapy and psychoanalysis has largely been lost and is now being kind of refound. So there's a lot of lost legacies that we're trying to recover.
I want to build on what you've just said, and in response to your question that I think is really important. One of the things that I think that I thought of as you outlined the history of changing ideas in analysis is it seemed to me that moving from the internal individual to a conceptualization of the social and the group occurred during the development of fascism in the 30s and Nazism. And so it seems to me that we have some repetition of history as we are now experiencing some of those same threats, both to the individual and to the group. And the moment to think about what you're talking about, what you brought up around liberation, identity, group action, is something that I'd like you to comment about in regards to what we are facing at this moment.
Yeah, what we're facing at this moment is quite a lot. I think that there are different kinds of interiority, so that I think that what psychoanalysis has been very good at developing is something about my individual interiority, or maybe the interiority that happens in the consulting room. And then there are interiorities to groups. And for a group, we were talking a little bit at the break, Robin, that for a group to get to a place where it really is a good working group takes quite a lot of work. And when I say work, I mean the kind of work that is done in psychoanalysis, that it's to developing that kind of trust that you're trying to develop with Lily. If we were to start processing together in this room, it would take us quite some time before we got to the place where we would make a good working group. And what do I mean by a good working group? I mean that we would have some kind of common aim that we could share that would hold us together. And that part of that common aim would be that we would have as a priority for us as a group to preserve the difference of our membership, that the difference between each other would be prized. Right now in the United States, I think we're in a position where we're not at that level of working as a group. What we have instead are factions that are trying to, like, I was saying earlier that there's a kind of centrifugal force in a group that starts to pull it apart. And that one of the responses that a group can have to that centrifugal force is a kind of a violently imposed homogeneity. And so that I think that we have factions that are saying you have to get behind this order and kind of be the same, that we're not interested in protecting the difference. That difference seems actually quite dangerous because it's very unsettling to be pulled apart. Like that's why one needs to develop a holding environment, say in dyadic work, where you can start to really get undone, right? That as a country, we're not anywhere near that. So maybe we just have to hit bottom. Maybe we haven't quite gotten there yet. The unfortunate thing is that a lot of people are going to suffer in the process. So as analysts, I think one of the things that we've inherited is a fear of groups. I think that has a lot to do with, Freud and the group paper. He draws a lot from Le Bon. Le Bon is talking about the mob and the Paris Commune and the violence and so forth. And so we've tended, in general, again, this is a generality, tended to think of groups as psychotic entities, that don't have a true psychology. Freud talked about the poverty of group psychology. I'm interested in talking about the poverty of the group in psychology, and I'm interested in talking about the poverty that we have in thinking about group psychology. So I think that the only way that you can come up against a mob is with a group. So that we need to help develop our capacities for doing this kind of work. And I believe a lot in working within your sphere of influence. My sphere of influence is organizational psychoanalysis. So I'm working hard, to try to bring this kind of thinking into those kinds of spaces, hopefully to open up gated communities of the mind in ways that become a little bit more attractive to other people.
I do wonder if we have any questions on the Zoom, just to give those folks a chance to.
Thanks for thinking of it.
Yes, there are actually some on Zoom. So shall I read one now to you guys? All right. So this question is, a home within supports therapists who see current and former foster youth for open-ended pro bono depth therapy. Therapists meet in small, ongoing consultation groups led by senior volunteer clinicians. How do you see the risks and opportunities of this non-transactional frame? And this is from Mary Hake, I'm not sure, chapter director of Alameda County, The Home Within.
First of all, I think that we should be very grateful, for organizations like A Home Within, and it's really amazing to see where A Home Within started and how it's developed, over the years. It's an extraordinary accomplishment, and one of the ways in which something like a community psychoanalysis is practiced. So I think that the question, I guess, was about a non-transactional kind of setting, and I take it that what that might mean is that there's not an exchange of money, though of course there is an exchange of money. It's just being exchanged in a different kind of way than maybe between patient and therapist. But there's again, coming back to the question of materiality, there's some kind of materiality back there that's supporting that kind of network, but it's distributed in a different kind of way. So first, just to note that, I think that there are different kinds of transactions, and that maybe rather than transaction is a very kind of monetary term, maybe we could say there's different kinds of exchanges, and that there's an exchange of time, of attention, that there can be ways in which not having any explicit monetary exchange, which is kind of the universal signifier of exchange in our culture, that there are risks associated with that, that could lead to regressions that are not therapeutic regressions, for example, or a sense that things are limitless, when we have to, as human beings, live with limitation. But I think that the exchanges that occur there, which are of a different order, are extraordinary and profound. And like I say, mostly I'm just really grateful for organizations like that are doing the kind of work that are trying to take up the slack of where the systems that that are the people who drop through the cracks are being taken up, by organizations like A Home Within.
That's great. Thank you. Any other questions from our group here? Yeah.
I'm a second year resident. I have very limited therapy experience so far, but just a common theme that I was hearing throughout your discussion, in terms of these like gated communities and the dyad and different ways to build trust and confianza, particularly within these cultural settings. I'm wondering if you specifically, I mean, the example you gave of going to the house with the antipsychotics, in that case, you were not the therapist, and you did go there, but I don't know how much of yourself that you were bringing versus like Concha was clearly bringing like her own background in. But in your therapeutic dyads, how much of like self-disclosure and like breaking down your own barriers are you like reconceptualizing your therapeutic relationship in that way too?
Yeah, I think that when I started, to practice therapy and when I started to practice psychoanalysis, I was pretty pristine, about those things. And, I think that was very helpful to begin there, like to have a very solid and kind of externalized notion of the framework, that I didn't have it so much in my bones. And so I really depended a lot on a certain kind of almost behaviorist, kind of way of thinking about that. And I was not very self-disclosing at all early on. That's really changed over the years. And I think it's changed because my notion of how framing happens has really changed. And I think because I've got more experience and I have a pretty clear sense of where the frame is. And so I'm much more self-disclosing and open now than I used to be. And it depends a lot on the particularities of who I'm working with. How much confianza has been developed, like how much we have, what used to be called the therapeutic alliance, and that we both understand something about our roles and how I can be used. And so I'm careful at the beginning because I'm just trying to really protect that space. But the further that we're in, the more that I think that some kind of self-disclosure, and that can happen on a lot of different levels, becomes not only okay, but necessary for an alive transformational process to occur. And so those kinds of self-disclosures have gone all the way from, something like saying to a patient, yeah, you're actually really pissing me off, like that kind of just disclosing something about my affective state, to saying things, like, yeah, I'm going to the March on Washington. Evan asked, she said, wait a second, you're taking a break at the same time I'm taking a break. What's happening then? Are you going to the march? And I said, yeah, I'm going to the march. And so we talked about that, and then we talked about before and then after, and that there was a way in which we didn't see each other. I mean, there was a million people, but that there was a way in which I think that there was something again about the materiality of knowing that we were both part of this big mob or crowd or group, that we were materially both part of that, and then talking about it afterwards, that actually was healing to a process of consolidating an interior group. So yeah, I'm a lot more open. Nowadays I text with patients. There was a time when I never would have texted with patients, but now I feel like it's a pretty important part of what I do, and it's really, really helpful. But I can also spend a long time trying to decide if I'm going to use a comma or a period in a particular text. It's like that there's like the specificity, the nuance of communication, because it's so open to interpretation, I'm really careful about. But yeah, I've changed a lot in that way.
Thank you.
Okay. We'll take one from here, but I see the hands up on this side as well.
Okay, maybe a quick one. I'm Donna Tversky, but also a UCSF resident and feel very attached to my training at the General, among other places. My question now is your associations, if you will, to the fact that and kind of how your theories get updated, given that so much of our relationship is either with devices or with particular groups, environments on those devices, and how that is influencing the social unconscious and kind of just where your mind goes with that.
Yeah, it's a great question. There's an analyst in New York, Patricia Clough, who has been writing and thinking a lot about this question. And she says that we're at a time right now when we have to rethink the individual, because the individual, is no longer just individual. That I can be all by myself, and I'm so plugged in to these networks that it's really changing something about how we even think about what an individual is. That it's really undergoing an enormous transformation. We were talking a little bit about that, at the break too, and how I think that won't speak for you, but that we both have a similar sense, right?
Yeah, so as you all probably heard during my introduction, I will be a child fellow. And one thing I'm really passionate about is digital tools and the media. When I grew up, you had that ad from 1995. We had cell phones, right? Like we had technology, and for youth of today, they're growing up with it. They're using it in schools. And even though there's some countries that are maybe trying to ban technologies from the school, for example, there's really no way to eradicate the fact that we are interfacing with a digital world, and that growing minds are going to be exposed to social media. And we know that youth are really good about taking in the outside world. So there's something about using more of that interface, our digital world, thinking about digital tools and the ways we think about healing for our youth and for even adults who do not feel separated from their social media, who feel like they as an individual may be the same and or different from the individual that they are when they're on Instagram or TikTok or Twitch. There's all these different domains that are now intersecting just for the personal alone.
It's humbling to think that when I grew up, our great technological innovation was the 8-track tape. It's a very, very different head. But my nephew told me once that he and his younger sister, who's 5 years younger, said, we're in completely different generations. I mean, like I grew up, we had modems. She was like a total Wi-Fi kid. Like they never even had modems, and we think about everything differently because of that. So yeah, I think that it's a huge area of that will need a lot of people like you, to help us think about. And we haven't mentioned specifically, but the whole domain of AI, which is, just beginning to explode, and I think is going to be enormous. And there's a lot of interesting work happening in some psychoanalytic circles about AI, and trying to think a little bit about what that portends. But I think that we're going to see an enormous shift in what psyche is and how it operates, and we need to be able to open things up to really, make sense of that.
I missed some of your talk earlier, but I wanted to ask you, when you were saying that group therapy or group work was underdeveloped as a way to work with, this is understood, like the ability to have a psychoanalytic group or an interior understanding of how to be with the differences and complexity. What are some of your brainstorms of ways you could do that in a group setting, or have done that. And that's one part of the question. The other is, I felt like you were saying that you would be bringing that into the therapy in some ways by creating those types of, like, maybe like in the relationship with a therapist, that sort of simulation of sisterhood or whatever it is that's going to feel like a group field. And I can see how that's valuable for a client who, like, anyone who's been part of a subgroup, like a racial subgroup or something, to feel like a sense of, well, I'm reducing it. I mean to say belonging, but I'm wondering, there's also this feeling people have of, I don't really belong to a group. I was failed. My groups failed me. My community failed me. And so seeking individual therapy is like, I finally get a space for me. And so I'm trying to understand how you do that. Like what I'm trying to say here?
I think, I mean, I have some notion, and then you tell me if I know what you're trying to say or not. Starting with the first question, there's a huge, body of specifically psychoanalytic theorizing and praxis around groups. So there's just a lot there. I think part of my particular contention is that in conventional organizational psychoanalysis, we've split off that area of knowledge, and that it would be useful to integrate it. And the reason for that, I think, is that we're all a part of, say, for you mentioned racial subgroups. We're all a part of a racial group. Everybody in here is a part of a racial group. How to get more conscious about what that means, the complexity of that, I think, is that if group theory helps us try to do that. So when I talk about belonging to a group, I mean that in a psychoanalytic way. And what that means to me is that it's not just this rosy, sweet, warm thing. Belonging is a complicated thing, and that we're also subjected in that belonging. We're also ejected in that belonging. We're also like co-opted and assimilated and exploited in that belonging, as well as maybe, hopefully, having a sense of safety and nurturance and a way of opening ourselves up. But belonging, I don't mean that in just a nice way. I do. My personal belief is that it's impossible not to have membership in groups. Like, I think even the Unabomber, which is maybe as far as you can get, like that you can really try to actively divorce yourself. But even that act of divorcing yourself is already a relationship to the group. Just like I think in conventional psychoanalysis, you don't get to say, like, I don't have any kind of relationship with my parents. That may not be a good relationship. It may be a relationship of absence. It may be a relationship of intrusion, but you're necessarily in relation to others. We know from the early, remember Spitz babies, like if you're actually completely isolated as a baby, you're dead, right? And I think that that's true at other levels, psychic levels. Human beings are social animals, and I don't think that we can exist, alone. So I think that there's always a way of trying to think more deeply. And, it's just that I think psychoanalysis hasn't done enough because it hasn't done enough on its own group. The history of the history of psychoanalysis, like psychoanalysis needs psychoanalysis, the analysis of analysis. Because, say, part of what happened in the United States is that you had a bunch of immigrants who were fleeing World War II, coming here trying to assimilate, and then ended up in a guild system with MDs, and that whole history, which has now been pretty opened up. But when it wasn't, there could be a kind of unconsciousness about how strongly that influenced our theorizing and our ways of practice. So I think that there's always ways that we can do more to understand those group histories that open things up. Can I say one more thing? No, you go.
Oh, I just was wondering how you saw that happening in a group level, in therapist groups, and just on a practical way.
Yeah, I think of it in terms of there. doing group analysis, doing group relations conferences. I think that I see that in the kind of community psychoanalysis track that we've launched. There's a lot of other institutes around the country that are trying to develop initiatives around community work. I think right now there's in organizational psychoanalysis, there's an ascendancy of community psychoanalysis, so that there's more and more about like analysts leaving the consulting room and doing work out in the community in different kinds of ways. I have a colleague in Colombia who has worked with the Wiwa people and goes up into the mountains and does work there as an analyst in a multidisciplinary group. I could give you many examples like that. And so part of what I'm interested in is that get taught, that there be training for people who are thinking analytically, can bring the history of psychoanalysis, which I think is a deep and rich one, and learn more about how that gets applied in these other settings.
We probably have time for one more question, if there is one. If there isn't in the room, I can check with online attendees. One up here. Okay.
Well, first I want to thank you for doing the work you're doing. As a recent graduate who's in private practice and trying to do this kind of work, you're creating a richness of opportunity to keep learning and growing, and it's so needed. And so thank you for doing that, Francisco. Every time I hear from you, I'm like, oh yeah, I'm so inspired. So thank you. Something I'm experiencing in my own practice, and I'm just really curious about it, is what happens when that group third space starts to interrupt the alliance and create a rupture in a way. And sometimes it's not even legible. We don't know what's going on, or it's expected, or there's a way that it intrudes. And I'm just curious about, Evan, as an example, is one in which the group held you together. But what happens when there's rupture? What after alliance, when a rupture sort of intrudes in the group space through maybe different identities or experiences, or how you think of that?
Yeah, I mean that's hard to answer in 2 minutes and 47 seconds or whatever it is we've got. But what I'll say, maybe I'll answer by way of analogy that in psychoanalysis or in psychodynamic therapy, we certainly have a lot of experiences of rupture. We certainly have a lot of experiences of maternal, paternal family ruptures, of outright abuse. We have experiences of ruptures in the therapeutic relationship. And that what we learn is that, for analysis, repetition is necessary as a means of getting transference, as a means of getting into the problem on the inside rather than indicating the problem from the outside. So ruptures naturally happen in groups. I can give you the example of the work that I did on the Holmes Commission, which was about racism in American psychoanalysis. And part of the conclusion that we came to in that commission is racial enactments happen. How can they not happen? We've lived in a country that has, a history of racism. So you get enough people together who are diverse or even not, in a group, and you're going to have enactments. Just like when you start working with a patient, what happened to them is going to be enacted in the therapeutic relationship if you're deep enough in for long enough. And so just as we've found ways to contain and metabolize and work and repair with the individual, there are ways that groups can learn how to do that. But that has to be learned and taught and developed, and that's part of what I'm, trying to advocate. And thank you for your very nice words at the beginning.
So I think, well, first of all, thank you both for a really rich discussion, and thanks to the audience for your questions. We are right at time. And so let's thank one more time first Dr. Tosin Odebeyi. Give her a round of applause. And let's thank Dr. Francisco González.